Why socialism doesn't work.
Socialism has a remarkable track record. It has failed in Europe, failed in Asia, failed in Latin America, and failed in Africa, often simultaneously. And yet, every generation rediscovers it with the enthusiasm of someone who just invented the wheel. This video isn't a defense of capitalism. Markets have real problems. Inequality is real. Corporate greed is real. But the question we're asking today is narrower. Why does socialism as an economic system keep breaking down, regardless of who's running it and regardless of how noble the intentions are? We're going to look at the theory, the data, and the history, and we're going to be honest about what the evidence actually shows.
Let's start with something that sounds abstract but is actually the heart of the matter. In 1945, economist Friedrich Hayek published a paper called The Use of Knowledge in Society. It's not a long paper, but it might be the most important argument ever made against central economic planning. His point was simple. No single authority can know everything it would need to know to run an economy. Not because governments are stupid, though that certainly helps, but because economic knowledge is fundamentally dispersed. The farmer knows his soil. The shopkeeper knows her customers. The mechanic knows which parts are running low in his town. That knowledge is local, specific, and constantly changing. It cannot be collected, processed, and acted on by a central committee in time to be useful. In a market economy, prices do this automatically. When coffee becomes scarce, its price rises. Consumers buy less. Producers make more. Nobody had to issue a memo. The information traveled through the price signal instantly across millions of transactions. Remove that mechanism, as socialism does, and you have to replace it with something. What you replace it with is bureaucracy, committees, 5-year plans, and inevitably shortages. The Soviet Union employed hundreds of thousands of economic planners. They had entire ministries dedicated to calculating how much of everything should be produced and where it should go. And still, by the 1980s, Soviet citizens were waiting years for a car and months for a refrigerator, while the state had no reliable way to even know whether its factories were creating value or burning it. This isn't a moral failure, it's a math problem, and the math doesn't get easier just because the people in charge have good intentions.
Now let's talk about incentives, because this is where things get almost comedic. When you sever the link between effort and reward, people notice quickly. A Soviet factory manager's job wasn't to produce good products, it was to meet the quota. And quota systems, it turns out, are extraordinarily easy to game. Soviet nail factories were giving quotas measured by weight. They produced enormous, useless nails, heavy enough to meet the target, useless for anything else. The government changed the quota to quantity. The factories pivoted to producing thousands of tiny, useless nails. The nails just kept being useless. Only the size changed. This wasn't corruption. This wasn't malice. This was rational behavior inside a broken system. The same dynamic appeared in agriculture. Collective farms, Soviet kolkhozes, Maoist communes in China consistently underperformed compared to private plots, even tiny ones. In China in the late 1970s, private plots represented about 7% of agricultural land, but produced roughly 33% of total agricultural output. When people farm for themselves, they farm better. When they farm for the collective, they farm just enough. And this scales. It scales to hospitals where doctors have no incentive to see more patients. It scales to factories where workers have no incentive to show up on time. It scales to entire economies where innovation stalls because there's no reward for risk. Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman put it plainly, nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as they spend their own. Central planners are always spending somebody else's money, all of it, all the time.
And before we get to the numbers, let's be clear about something that statistics tend to sanitize. The 20th century's socialist experiments weren't just economic failures, they were human catastrophes. The Soviet Union's forced collectivization in the early 1930s caused a famine, known as the Holodomor in Ukraine, that killed between 3 and 7 million people. Not from drought, not from bad luck, from policy. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward between 1959 and 1961 produced a famine that killed somewhere between 15 and 55 million people. It remains the deadliest famine in recorded human history. And it happened because a central committee decided it knew better than farmers how to farm. Cambodia, under the Khmer Rouge, attempted to build a pure agrarian socialist state in the 1970s. They evacuated entire cities at gunpoint and abolished money overnight. Roughly a quarter of the entire population was dead within 4 years. These weren't accidents or unfortunate side effects. They were the direct result of states concentrating absolute economic and political power and then using it. When you remove the mechanisms that distribute power, markets, private property, rule of law, you don't get equality. You get whoever is left holding the gun.
If theory isn't convincing enough, we have something better, a series of natural experiments that ran for decades. After World War II, ideologically opposed systems were applied to populations with nearly identical cultures, histories, and starting conditions. It's the closest thing social science gets to a controlled experiment. East Germany versus West Germany, North Korea versus South Korea, mainland China versus Taiwan. By 1989, West Germany's GDP per capita was roughly 3 times East Germany's. South Korea's economy today is approximately 40 times larger than North Korea's, for a population only twice the size. You can literally see the difference from space. Satellite images show South Korea blazing with light, North Korea almost entirely dark. These aren't cherry-picked. These are the most comparable pairs we have, and the results are consistent. Then there's Venezuela. In 1999, Venezuela was one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America. It had and still has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. You would think that would provide some margin for error. It didn't. After 2 decades of socialist economic policies, nationalization of industries, price controls, currency manipulation, Venezuela experienced one of the worst peacetime economic collapses in modern history. By 2019, GDP had contracted by more than 50%. Inflation peaked at over 1 million% annually. More than 5 million people left the country. A country that was exporting oil was importing food and still running out of it. The standard response to this is, that wasn't real socialism. We'll address that in a moment. But first, notice how convenient that argument is. Every failure is disqualified after the fact. Every success would have been claimed immediately.
Let's take this argument seriously because it deserves a real answer. The claim is that the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, Cambodia, none of these represent true socialism. True socialism has simply never been tried. There are a few problems with this. First, all of these regimes called themselves socialist. They were recognized as socialist by contemporary socialist movements. They implemented socialist policies, collective ownership, central planning, abolition of private markets. If none of them count, the definition of socialism has become unfalsifiable, and an unfalsifiable claim isn't a political theory, it's a religion. Second, the argument ignores the countries that moved away from socialist policies and improved. China after 1978, Vietnam after 1986. Both introduced market reforms, private ownership, price signals, foreign investment, and both experienced dramatic reductions in poverty as a result. China alone lifted roughly 800 million people out of poverty over 40 years. That didn't happen through central planning. It happened when they stopped doing central planning. Third, the Scandinavian counterexample, which is where most people land when pressed, isn't actually socialism. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway have market economies with private ownership, free trade, and profit-driven enterprise. They are highly regulated welfare states with generous redistribution. That's a legitimate policy debate, but it's not the same thing as collective ownership of the means of production. The Danes would be the first to tell you that.
So, what does the evidence point toward? Mixed economies, market mechanisms with strong institutions, rule of law, and targeted redistribution. Not because markets are morally superior, they're not a moral system, they're a coordination mechanism, but because they process information and reward productivity in ways that central planning cannot replicate. The countries with the highest human development indexes, Norway, Switzerland, Australia, the Netherlands, combine competitive markets with robust social safety nets. They regulate, they tax, they redistribute, but they don't abolish prices and they don't nationalize industries wholesale. The evidence also shows that economic freedom correlates strongly with prosperity. The Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom Index, the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, both show consistent positive correlations between market freedom and GDP per capita, life expectancy, and reduction in poverty. This isn't a right-wing talking point, it's a pattern in the data. That doesn't mean inequality doesn't matter. It does. That doesn't mean markets are always right. They fail in specific, well-documented ways. Externalities, monopolies, public goods. The policy response to those failures matters enormously. But the response, replace the market entirely, has been tried, repeatedly, at enormous human cost, and it hasn't worked.
The failure of socialism isn't a failure of courage or commitment or idealism. Some of the most dedicated, intelligent people of the 20th century gave their lives to building socialist societies. The failure is structural. It's a system that asks human beings to behave differently than they do, and then is surprised when they don't. It's a system that assumes information can be centralized when by its nature it can't. And it's a system that eliminates the feedback mechanisms that tell you when you're going wrong, which is precisely when you most need them. The goal of broadly shared prosperity, dignity for working people, and protection from poverty, those are legitimate and important goals. The disagreement isn't about the destination. It's about whether abolishing markets gets you there. The evidence, so far, suggests it doesn't. This is peak economics, where history, data, and theory meet without the noise. If this video made you think, even if you disagree, consider subscribing. More videos like this are coming. No ideology, no shouting, just evidence. And if you found it useful, a like helps more people find it. Peak economics.